Welcome to the world where we listen, we relax, and we get sleepy. My name's Brian, and I'm your host. Thank you so much for tuning in. I will read our lovely story, Hercules and the Horses. This is your ultimate destination for soothing bedtime stories crafted specifically for grown-ups. Each story is designed to help you unwind, release the stress of the day, and drift into a peaceful night's sleep. Whether you love cozy narratives, gentle adventures, or calming tales, we have something that will ease your mind and bring comfort to your bedtime routine. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a story. If there's a specific type of story you'd love to hear, feel free to leave your suggestions in the comments. We're always excited to tailor our content to your preferences. Relax, get comfortable, and enjoy the calm journey to sleep. Sweet dreams and restful nights await. The rain fell in sheets, a steady rhythm drumming against the ancient roof of Edgewater Manor. The old house seemed to breathe with the storm, its timbers creaking, the windows shuddering as if whispering secrets long kept in the dark. The wind pressed against the heavy velvet curtains, but they held firm, sealing Mara Sinclair inside with the warmth of a solitary fire. Beyond the glass panes, the world was a blur of rain and darkness. Mara sat alone in the manor's grand sitting room, her book lying half open and forgotten on a small table next to her. She could not shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. The house was quiet, yet the silence seemed to hum with an unseen presence. She knew it well, this feeling. Ever since she had inherited Edgewater Manor from her mother, she'd been haunted by the weight of those who had lived there before. Her mother, her grandmother, and her great-grandmother had all guarded this house, as if protecting something precious, or perhaps something dangerous. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old windows. Mara pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, but the sound persisted. A strange, mournful cry that rose and fell with the gusts. She sat up, straining to hear over the roar of the storm. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. A single word, repeated as if carried by the wind itself. Help. Mara's heart skipped. She turned toward the window, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she saw it. A pale, ghostly figure moving beyond the glass, barely visible through the sheets of rain. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the night. A chill crawled up her spine, and she forced herself to stand. She had to know. She had to be sure it wasn't just her imagination, twisted by the howling storm. She grabbed a flashlight from the entryway, pulling a heavy wool coat from the rack. The cold air hit her as she opened the back door, the storm wrapping around her like an icy cloak. She hesitated, the warmth of the house behind her pulling her back. But the whisper came again, clearer now. Help me. Mara stepped out, pulling the door shut behind her, and plunged into the wet darkness. The rain was relentless, drenching her to the bone within seconds, but she pressed on, her flashlight casting a narrow beam through the thick blackness. The garden, once grand and meticulously maintained, was now a wild tangle of overgrown bushes and ivy, twisted together in the shadows. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the crack of branches in the wind, seemed amplified, the storm and orchestra of unnerving noises. "Hello!" Mara called, but her voice was swallowed by the storm, lost before it even left her lips. She pushed forward, the mud sucking at her boots, the chill of the rain numbing her hands. She knew these grounds well. She had wandered them as a child, playing hide and seek among the roses and ancient oaks. But now, under the storm's shadow, They felt strange, foreign, hostile. At the edge of the garden, where the trees thickened into dense forest, she saw it again. A fleeting glimpse of white, a figure drifting among the trunks, her face turned away. Mara's breath caught. It wasn't possible. She was alone here, and yet she moved closer, fighting the urge to turn back, the flashlight's beam bouncing wildly with her shaky steps. Then, without warning, the light flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. Panic gripped her, but before she could react, a flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the woods in stark, unnatural brilliance. In that moment, she saw the woman clearly. A pale face, eyes wide with sorrow, a tattered white dress clinging to her slender frame. And just as quickly, the light was gone, leaving only the memory of that haunted gaze burned into Mara's mind. "Wait!" she cried, stumbling forward, but the figure was gone, swallowed by the trees. Her flashlight sputtered back to life, casting a weak, unsteady glow. Desperation pushed her onward, the storm growing fiercer with each step, as if the world itself were urging her to stop. But she couldn't. Not now, not after what she'd seen. The trees grew denser, their branches tangling overhead, blocking out even the storm's weak moonlight. Mara's heart hammered in her chest, each step slower, heavier. She was about to turn back when she saw it, a shape looming in the darkness. A small, half-buried structure of cold gray stone stood hidden among the undergrowth. An old mausoleum, long forgotten, with a crumbling angel statue perched above its entrance, wings spread wide in silent warning. The door was ajar, barely a crack, just enough to invite the curious and the desperate. Mara hesitated, her instincts screaming to turn back, but the whisper returned, urgent and pleading. "Help me!" Her fingers, shaking with cold and fear, pushed the heavy door open. Inside, the air was stale, untouched by the storm that raged just beyond the threshold. Dust and decay settled over the stone interior, and an overwhelming silence fell around her. She swept the flashlight across the space, revealing faded carvings on the walls and the remnants of old, crumbling coffins. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it lay a single leather-bound journal. The journal seemed out of place, clean, almost untouched, despite the thick layer of dust that coated everything else. Mara's breath hitched as she stepped closer, drawn to it by an invisible force. She reached out, fingers brushing the worn leather, and opened it. The pages were old, brittle, but the ink was clear, written in a careful, elegant hand. Her great-grandmother's name, Margaret Sinclair, was written in the margins, alongside dates and strange, desperate notes. Mara's eyes widened as she read, the storm's fury fading to a distant roar. The entries were fragmented, a tangled web of visions, apparitions, and strange occurrences that mirrored her own unsettling experiences. The final entry was dated exactly 100 years ago, this very night. It was short, only a single line. "She has come again, and the storm will not be silenced." A cold, dry wind brushed against the back of her neck, and Mara spun around, flashlight slicing through the dark. There, in the doorway, stood the woman from the woods, her face partially hidden in shadow. Her eyes, wide and filled with anguish, locked onto Mara's. "Please," she said, her voice soft and breaking, "help me find peace." Before Mara could respond, the figure dissolved into nothing, leaving only the echo of her plea hanging in the still, damp air. Mara's pulse raced, her grip tightening on the journal. Whatever was happening, whatever her great-grandmother had started, it was not over. The answers lay in this journal, and somewhere deep within the walls of Edgewater Manor. With the journal clutched against her chest, Mara stumbled back through the woods, the storm crashing around her like a wave. By the time she reached the manor's rear entrance, she was soaked and shivering, her fingers numb and stiff. The house loomed above, darker and heavier than before, its shadow stretching long and deep against the lightning-streaked sky. Inside, the warmth had fled. The fire was cold, and the air felt still, as if holding its breath. She set the journal on the small table next to her chair, eyes flicking to the darkened corners of the room. The house seemed alive, charged with a strange energy, as if waiting for her to make the next move. With a deep, shuddering breath, she sat by the dying hearth and opened the journal once more. The storm was a muffled roar outside, the windows rattling softly. She flipped through the pages, searching for something, anything, that would make sense of the figure in the woods and the voice that called her into the night. The secrets of Edgewater Manor were beginning to unravel, and Mara could not escape the feeling that she was merely a player in a story written long ago. A story of loss, of lingering spirits, and a family curse that had yet to be resolved. The rain poured on, the storm growing stronger as she turned the page. The storm had not eased. It raged with the same ferocity as when Mara first stepped outside, chasing a voice she could barely comprehend. But now she was back in the manor, the journal heavy in her lap, the fire in the hearth struggling to catch hold. The wood hissed and cracked, casting flickering light that barely pushed back the encroaching shadows. The house seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the storm, each gust of wind rattling the old windows and stirring the ancient curtains. Mara sat in the faded armchair, her fingers tracing the edges of the journal's leather cover. It was a relic like so much in this house, an echo of the past, a family heirloom no one had spoken of, a secret hidden within the walls of Edgewater Manor. Her great-grandmother, Margaret Sinclair, had written it with careful, elegant script. Each page held the weight of a century-old sorrow, and Mara could almost feel the tension seeping through the paper. She opened to where she had left off, the storm's distant roar a murmur behind her. The first entries were mundane, mentions of daily life in Edgewater Manor, the maintenance of the garden, the social gatherings. But slowly, Margaret's tone changed. Her words grew urgent, filled with hints of something darker, something creeping at the edges of their well-kept lives. February 3rd, 1924. I saw her again tonight, in the garden near the old well. She was just a shadow, a flicker at the corner of my eye, but I felt her, watching, waiting. Who is she? Why does she linger? Mara's breath quickened as she read. She turned the page, unable to stop herself. March 14th, 1924. The storms have returned, worse than before. There's a heaviness in the air, as if the very house knows something I do not. The servants are whispering again. They say it's her, the woman in white, cursed to wander the grounds until the old debt is paid. I wish they would not speak of such things, but I cannot deny what I have seen. The entries grew more frantic, hinting at rituals and strange symbols. Mara felt a chill settle over her. These were not the idle musings of a lonely woman. They were the desperate warnings of someone who had seen things that defied explanation. As she read, the room seemed to darken, the fire's light swallowed by the oppressive shadows that pooled in the corners. Mara's fingers trembled as she turned the pages, her focus so intense that she barely noticed the sudden drop in temperature. A chill swept over her, so sharp and sudden that she gasped, her breath misting in the air. She looked up, startled, and for a moment, she thought she saw a shape in the hallway mirror, a pale face staring back at her. But when she blinked, it was gone, replaced by her own reflection, wide-eyed and frightened. She forced herself to continue, reading the journal under the weak light of the fire. The next entries were filled with accounts of strange occurrences, doors that creaked open on their own, windows that rattled without wind, voices that called from empty rooms. The servants had left by then, refusing to stay in a house they claimed was cursed. Margaret was alone, just as Mara was now, haunted by something she couldn't understand. April 9th, 1924. I can no longer deny it. There is a presence here, something that does not belong. Last night, I heard her crying, a soft, pitiful wail that echoed through the walls. It led me to the old nursery, a room I have not visited in years. There, in the moonlight, I saw her. She was standing by the window, looking out into the storm, her face obscured by shadow. She turned, and I swear, for a moment our eyes met. Then she vanished, like a breath of wind. I cannot stay here much longer. I feel as though I am being watched, as if the house itself is waiting for me to do something. But what? Mara's eyes lingered on that last line. Her great-grandmother's desperation felt achingly familiar, a thread that stretched across time to bind them together. She closed the journal, her thoughts a whirl of fear and uncertainty. She needed to understand what had happened here, to know why this spirit, this mysterious woman, had chosen her family. What was the debt Margaret had mentioned? What had they done to earn the curse? Suddenly, the old grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, its deep chimes reverberating through the house. Mara jumped, nearly dropping the journal, and the fire flickered violently, sending shadows dancing across the walls. The house felt alive, thrumming with a quiet energy that made her skin prickle. She needed answers, and she knew where to begin. The journal had mentioned a room, the old nursery. Mara had never been inside. As a child, her mother had kept it locked, and after inheriting the manor, Mara had never found the key. But now she was determined. There was something there, something that Margaret had seen, and she had to know what it was. Leaving the warmth of the sitting room, Mara stepped into the cold hallway. The house was utterly still, the only sound the soft patter of rain against the windows. Her footsteps echoed as she climbed the grand staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. The upper floor was darker, colder, as if the house itself was warning her to turn back. At the end of the hallway, past portraits of long-dead relatives whose eyes seemed to follow her every move. She found it, the door to the nursery. It was small, tucked away behind a faded tapestry, almost hidden from sight. Mara's fingers brushed the cold wood, feeling the weight of history pressing down on her. The door was locked, just as she had expected. She hesitated, then remembered the old cabinet in the study, a place where her mother had kept family relics and trinkets. The study was cluttered with old memories, but if there was a key, it would be there. Back in the study, Mara rifled through drawers, searching for anything that might unlock the door. Her hands moved quickly, pushing aside old photographs, tarnished silver spoons, and faded letters. Then she found it, a small brass key, tucked inside an embroidered pouch, hidden beneath a stack of yellowed papers. It looked ancient, its surface worn smooth by time. A sense of triumph surged through her, but it was mixed with dread. She knew this key was important, that it had been hidden for a reason. Heart pounding, she returned to the nursery door, the key cold in her palm. She hesitated for a long moment, listening to the silence of the house, then slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click, and the door creaked open. The air inside was cold and dry, carrying the scent of dust and age. Mara's flashlight revealed an old crib, a rocking chair, and shelves lined with forgotten toys. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if the room had been frozen in time. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the storm's light, and the only sound was her own shallow breathing. She stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath her. Her flashlight beam caught a glimmer of something shiny, half hidden under a pile of old blankets in the corner. She bent down, her fingers brushing against something cold and metallic, a small silver locket. It was intricately engraved, and when she opened it, she saw a tiny portrait inside. The woman's face was familiar, yet distant. Her eyes were wide, filled with a sorrow that seemed to reach across time. Mara barely had a moment to react before the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Her breath fogged in the air, and the shadows seemed to ripple. She turned, heart thundering, and saw her. The woman in white, standing in the corner of the room, her face half hidden by dark, tangled hair. She did not speak, but her eyes held Mara's, pleading, desperate. Then, just as suddenly, she was gone. Mara stumbled back, clutching the locket tightly, her mind racing. There was something here, something her great-grandmother had hidden, something tied to the spirit that haunted the house. She knew, without a doubt, that the journal held more secrets. But now, she had a clue. The locket, the woman's sorrowful gaze, and the hidden past of Edgewater Manor. She needed to go back to read more, to find out who the woman was, and why she could not rest. But the house was awake now, and Mara knew she was not alone. The storm grew louder, the wind howling against the walls, as if urging her to hurry. The following morning, Mara awoke to a house shrouded in an uneasy calm. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the very air held its breath. Edgewater Manor was heavy with anticipation, and Mara felt the weight of the previous night pressing down on her as she sat in the study, the silver locket resting in front of her. She had barely slept, haunted by the vision of the woman in white and the icy chill of the nursery. The locket was a clue, but she still didn't know who the woman was or why she seemed so tormented. Her fingers traced the delicate etchings on the locket's surface, her thoughts spinning in circles. She knew the answers lay within the journal, and she was determined to find them, no matter what it might reveal about her family's history. Mara opened the journal again, turning the brittle pages with care. She was no longer reading out of curiosity. Now, it was a desperate search for truth. Margaret's words had become more erratic, more fearful, and Mara felt her ancestors' anxiety in every shaky line. April 15th, 1924. I found the locket in the nursery. I do not know how it got there, but it must have belonged to her, the woman who haunts these halls. It was hidden among baby clothes, long forgotten. I have tried to return it, to place it back where I first saw her, but it has a way of finding me again. I fear it is a tether, a link between her world and mine. The house is changing. I hear her more often now, whispering my name, begging for something I cannot give. What does she want from me? Mara shivered, her fingers closing around the locket once more. She knew she needed to delve deeper into the house, into the secrets Margaret had tried to bury. The nursery had given her a glimpse of the past, but she sensed there were more secrets hidden within Edgewater Manor. Her great-grandmother had clearly known more than she had revealed, and it was up to Mara to uncover what had truly happened. Over the next few days, Mara scoured the manor, searching for anything that might help her understand the curse. She started in the obvious places: the attic, the library, the old servants' quarters. She moved furniture, pried open dusty trunks, and unearthed forgotten relics of the Sinclair family's past. The air in the house felt charged, as if it anticipated each discovery with a silent intensity. Then, behind a loose panel in the library's wall, she found it, a hidden room, its entrance masked by a heavy bookcase. Dust hung in the air as she stepped inside, her flashlight illuminating the small, cramped space. It was a room untouched by time, filled with strange symbols carved into the walls and a low, stone altar covered in faded velvet cloth. Shelves were lined with candles, and a few ancient books lay scattered across a heavy oak table. The room smelled of old parchment, wax, and something metallic that made Mara's stomach churn. Her eyes fell on a single book lying in the center of the table. It was a leather-bound volume, similar to the journal but older, its pages filled with arcane symbols and notes scrawled in Margaret's handwriting. The text was mostly in Latin, interspersed with phrases in Old English that Mara struggled to decipher, but the drawings were unmistakable. Pentagrams, protective sigils, and strange geometric patterns she had never seen before. This was no ordinary study. It was a ritual room, a place where dark secrets had been sought and hidden. Mara's breath caught as she flipped through the book. The notes were fragmented, detailing spells of protection and rituals for communion with the dead. Her great-grandmother had been desperate, clearly trying to find a way to ward off the curse, to keep the spirit at bay. And then she found it, a passage that sent a chill down her spine. The debt must be paid in blood. The woman's sorrow binds her here, and until the price is given, she will not rest. Mara's heart sank. The debt, the curse, it was tied to this mysterious woman in white. But what had happened? Who was she? And why had her great-grandmother been so obsessed with trying to communicate with her? She turned another page, her hands shaking, and found a drawing of the silver locket. Beneath it, Margaret's handwriting was clear and precise. She comes when the moon is high, when the rain falls. She seeks what was taken, a life stolen, a promise broken. The locket is her key, but I do not know how to use it. I fear time is running out. Mara's mind whirled. The locket was central to the curse, a talisman that linked the restless spirit to the manor. But what promise had been broken? What debt had Margaret, and by extension the Sinclair family, failed to pay? That evening, the storm returned, as fierce and relentless as before. Mara sat in the darkened library, staring at the locket in her hand, feeling its cold weight against her skin. She knew she was being watched. The feeling had only grown stronger since she had found the hidden room. The air in the house felt electric, charged with a restless energy that made her nerves fray. She waited, knowing that the spirit would come. The clock struck midnight, and the storm's fury shook the house. Lightning flashed, illuminating the hallways for a split second, and then Mara heard it. A soft, pitiful cry echoing from upstairs. Her blood ran cold, but she stood, clutching the locket tightly. She had to know the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. The cry led her back to the nursery, the door standing wide open despite her having locked it earlier. The room was darker than before, the air thick with the scent of rain and damp earth. Mara stepped inside, her flashlight beam barely penetrating the gloom, and saw her again, the woman in white, standing by the window, her back turned. But this time she did not disappear. Instead, she slowly turned to face Mara, her eyes hollow, her face pale and gaunt. Mara's heart pounded as she raised the locket, holding it out like a shield. The woman's gaze fell upon it, and for a moment, something like recognition flickered in her empty eyes. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and whispered a single word, "Promise," and then she was gone, vanished into the shadows like a breath of wind. Mara stumbled back, gasping, the word echoing in her mind. A promise, something tied to the locket, to the family's past. Her great-grandmother had been searching for answers, just as she was now, and Mara was beginning to understand why. There was a story here, buried beneath generations of silence, and she had to bring it to light. The next day, exhausted and on edge, Mara returned to the hidden room with the ritual book. She combed through Margaret's notes again, looking for anything she had missed. There were repeated mentions of a place, beneath the weeping willow, a location she recognized from the manor's overgrown gardens. The tree had always been there, a massive, ancient thing that loomed over the grounds like a sentinel. With the storm momentarily abated, she grabbed a shovel and went outside, feeling the cold bite of the wind against her face. The garden was tangled and wild, the paths nearly lost to time, but she made her way to the old willow, its branches swaying like skeletal fingers in the breeze. Mara dug where the roots twisted together, her fingers numb and dirty as she unearthed the frozen soil. Hours passed, and she was beginning to lose hope when her shovel struck something solid. Her heart leapt, and she fell to her knees, pulling away the dirt until she uncovered a small wooden chest, half-rotten and nearly falling apart. Inside, wrapped in faded velvet, was a diary, not her great-grandmother's, but one far older. Its pages were fragile, crumbling at the edges, but the handwriting was clear. The name at the beginning sent a shock through her. The woman in white had a name, Eleanor, and she had been part of the Sinclair family. Someone lost, someone forgotten. Mara's hands trembled as she read the first entry, her mind racing. She was closer now, closer than ever to the truth, but she knew the answers would not be easy. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Mara returned to the house with the diary, knowing that the final secrets of Edgewater Manor were within its pages, waiting to be revealed. The curse was real, and the past was not as dead as she had believed. And now it was calling to her as it had called to Margaret, as it had called to Eleanor. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing within her heart, and Mara knew she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The storm had returned, a relentless pounding against the manor's windows, the kind of storm that seemed to be as old as the house itself. The howling wind rattled the shutters, and the rain hammered against the glass in a ceaseless rhythm. Inside, Mara sat in the library, the diary of Eleanor Sinclair spread out before her, the pages fragile but insistent with the truth they held. The locket rested beside her, its cold silver surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. The words she had read in Eleanor's diary were stark, each sentence chilling her to the core. The story of the woman in white, Eleanor Sinclair, had begun to take shape, revealing a dark history that her family had long kept buried. But there was something more, something Mara had not yet fully understood. As her eyes scanned the delicate, curling script, she pieced together the fragments of a story lost to time. Eleanor had been young when she had first met the woman who would come to haunt her family. A servant, a woman of unknown origins, had appeared at the manor on a stormy night much like this one. She had been beautiful, ethereal, but with an air of sorrow that seemed to seep from her very being. She came in the night, a stranger with eyes that gleamed like silver, a sorrow I could not place. She told me she was lost, a soul wandering through time, seeking something she had forgotten. I did not know her name, but there was something in her presence that compelled me to listen. I offered her shelter, and she accepted without a word. But that night, everything changed. Eleanor had taken the woman in, offering her a bed and food. But from that night on, the strange happenings had begun. Whispers in the halls, cold spots in the house, and the sound of footsteps in empty rooms. It was as if the very air in the manor had thickened with a sense of foreboding, and Eleanor, feeling the weight of it, had sought to uncover the woman's past. She told me she was bound to this place by a promise made long ago, in a time when the house was not yet built, and the land was still wild. The price of her promise had not been paid, and she could not move on until it was. She said she would remain, wandering through time, until the debt was settled. The house would be her prison, and her soul would be bound to it forever. Mara's heart thudded painfully in her chest. The woman in white, Eleanor's mysterious guest, was not a ghost but something much older, something bound by a promise that had been broken. A promise her family had made and forgotten. A debt had been incurred, and now the spirit wandered through time, waiting for restitution. She never told me who had made the promise, nor what the debt was, but I knew it was tied to this house, to the land upon which it stood. And I knew that if the price was not paid, she would never leave. Mara's hands shook as she read the final entries in the diary. The last pages were hurriedly written, the words slanted and desperate. Eleanor had begun to fear for her life. The woman in white had grown more insistent, her presence more overpowering, her wails of sorrow filling the halls at night. She wants me to make the choice. She says the debt is mine now, that I must take the price upon myself. But I do not know what that means, only that she has begun to torment me. Her presence is everywhere, by the fire, at the window, by the door. I hear her whispering in the walls. She will not let me rest. I am afraid. I have made a terrible mistake. The last entry was a cryptic, unfinished sentence. If I do not make the sacrifice, she will. Mara stopped reading. Her breath caught in her throat. The words were unfinished. What had Eleanor meant by the sacrifice? What was the price of silence, of broken promises? She closed the diary, feeling the weight of its words like a physical burden. The woman in white had been searching for something, someone who could fulfill the promise that had been made long ago. And now that debt had passed to her, to the Sinclair bloodline. Her family had been silent, hiding the truth from generation to generation, but the spirit had never stopped searching, never stopped haunting. Mara stood and paced the room, the weight of the locket in her hand, her mind racing. The curse, the promise, the silence, they were all tied together. But what could she do? How could she break the chain of suffering that had plagued her family for so long? She couldn't keep running from the truth. The house was watching her, waiting for her to make a choice. The rain lashed against the windows, the storm growing in intensity once more. As Mara stood by the hearth, the flames casting long shadows across the room. The house seemed to hum, alive with a presence she couldn't escape. The air was thick, as if it too was waiting for something, waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to fall into place. Then, just as she was about to turn back to the journal, she heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible over the wind. Her name, a voice cold, distant, but unmistakable. Mara. Her heart raced, and she turned sharply, the room suddenly feeling colder, the shadows deeper. The whisper came again, more urgent this time. Mara. The woman in white appeared, standing at the edge of the room, her form flickering like a shadow. Her pale face was twisted in sorrow, her eyes hollow and empty. She gazed at Mara with a sadness that seemed to seep into her bones, her mouth moving soundlessly before the whisper came again. You are the last. Mara felt a coldness creep over her, and she could hardly breathe. The woman's words were heavy with finality, filled with a weight that crushed her chest. The promise must be kept. The debt must be paid. You must decide, Mara Sinclair. Will you pay the price, or will I take it from you? The words reverberated through the room, the walls seeming to close in around her. Mara's mind spun, the memories of her great-grandmother's journal and the cursed history of Edgewater Manor swirling together into a single terrifying realization. The woman in white had been searching for someone to fulfill the promise, to repay the debt. And now it was her turn to choose. The house was no longer just a house. It was a prison, a place of unfulfilled promises, of sorrow and suffering. The woman in white was not just a ghost, but a guardian of an ancient, broken pact. The curse had claimed her ancestors, and now it had come for her. Mara stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. The woman in white took a step closer, her form shimmering, fading in and out like the last breath of a dying flame. The debt must be paid, she repeated, her voice hollow, but I cannot tell you what the price will be. You must decide. You must choose to either take the debt upon yourself or set me free. Mara felt the weight of those words settle over her like a heavy shroud. She had spent days searching, uncovering the secrets of Edgewater Manor, but now the truth was unbearable. She had always known, deep down, that she couldn't outrun the past. But to make this choice, to take on the debt or release the spirit, was beyond anything she had imagined. The room felt suffocating, the walls pressing in as if the very house was watching her, waiting for her answer. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting eerie shadows across the floor, and the whispers in the walls grew louder, as if urging her to act. She looked at the locket, the symbol of the broken promise, the key to the curse. It was so cold in her hand now, colder than it had ever been before. I cannot decide, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know what to do. The woman's eyes met hers, filled with an emotion Mara could not place. Sorrow, regret, longing, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something else. A flicker of hope, a flicker of understanding. You have already chosen, Mara, the woman said softly, her voice barely a breath. The house has chosen for you. Mara's breath caught, her heart racing as she turned toward the window. The storm outside had intensified, the winds howling like a wild animal. But something had shifted in the house. The air was thick with tension, the shadows stretching and moving with a life of their own. The choice had already been made, and now Mara would have to live with the consequences. Mara's heart pounded against her ribs as the storm raged outside, the wind screeching through the old windows of Edgewater Manor. She couldn't seem to shake the feeling that the house itself was alive, the walls pulsing with an ancient energy that vibrated through her very bones. The woman in white. No, the spirit had spoken, and now, as she stood frozen in place, The weight of her words settled like a dense fog around her. The house has chosen for you. The realization hit her with a crushing force. The curse, the promise, the debt. It was all tied to her now, woven into the very fabric of her existence. The woman in white wasn't just a lost soul or an apparition. She was part of the house itself, part of the land, and she had been waiting for someone to answer the call, to fulfill the promise that had been broken so long ago. But what was the price? Mara turned slowly, her fingers clutching the cold, silver locket tightly, as though it held the answers to everything. The woman in white had faded again, her form flickering in the shadows like a memory. She could still feel her presence, though lingering in the air like a heavy mist. The house felt more oppressive than ever, its silence deafening. She knew it wasn't over. The choice she had made, whether she understood it or not, had only just begun. The fire in the hearth crackled, sending a burst of warmth into the room, but it did nothing to quell the chill that had settled deep within Mara's chest. She had crossed a threshold, stepped into a world where the lines between the living and the dead were blurred, and there was no turning back. She needed answers, and for that, she had to go deeper into the heart of the manor itself. Over the next few days, Mara hardly slept. The house seemed to hum with a restless energy, as if it were watching her, waiting for her to unravel the final pieces of the puzzle. Each night, she returned to the hidden room with the diary and the ritual book, searching for anything that could explain what the woman in white had meant by her cryptic words. The house had chosen for her, but what had she chosen? The woman's whispers still haunted her dreams, and each time she closed her eyes, Mara could hear them, soft, desperate, a pleading cry in the distance. Set me free, but what did it mean? Set her free from what, and at what cost? In the dead of night, when the wind howled through the trees outside and the rain lashed against the windows, Mara decided to confront the only person who might hold the key to her family's secrets, her great-grandmother. Margaret's journal had contained a wealth of information, but it had also left so many questions unanswered. The woman in white had tormented Margaret, and now, it seemed, it was Mara's turn. But before she could confront the past, she needed to understand it. She ventured down to the family crypt, an ancient stone structure buried beneath the sprawling gardens, overgrown with ivy and almost forgotten by time. Her great-grandmother's crypt was nestled among the others, a heavy stone door with elaborate engravings of angels and flowers etched into its surface. Mara had never dared to go inside until now, and as she approached, a strange sense of reverence overtook her. The crypt was not just a tomb. It was a place of finality, a place where secrets were buried, literally and figuratively. With a deep breath, she pushed open the door. The crypt was dark, damp, and cold, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. A single candle flickered on the stone altar, casting long shadows across the narrow space. It was a small room, with stone walls lined with the remains of her ancestors. But it wasn't the graves that caught her attention. It was the heavy iron chest sitting at the far end of the crypt. Mara approached it cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The chest was old, its surface tarnished and covered in layers of dust. It was bound in thick leather, with a brass lock that seemed out of place in such a solemn environment. As Mara knelt down to open it, her fingers trembled. What had her great-grandmother left behind? What had Margaret hidden from the rest of the world? The lock clicked open with an eerie finality, and Mara pulled the chest open. Inside, wrapped in a cloth stained with age and neglect, was a collection of letters, old, yellowed papers tied together with a faded ribbon. They looked like personal correspondences, the kind one would write in moments of isolation and desperation. With a shaking hand, Mara pulled them free, unfolding the first letter carefully. It was dated more than 50 years ago, written in Margaret's unmistakable handwriting. The letter was addressed to no one, but its words were clear. I fear I have made a terrible mistake. The woman, she is no longer just a memory. She is a curse, an ancient force that cannot be ignored. I thought I could help her. I thought I could free her from the debt that binds her to this place. But I was wrong. It is not a debt that can be repaid. She wants something more, something that cannot be given. I have seen her face again and again, in the shadows, in the mirrors. She whispers my name, calls for me, and I fear the day will come when she will take me as she has taken so many before. Mara's heart raced as she read the letter, her pulse quickening. Her great-grandmother had known. Margaret had known exactly what the woman in white wanted, what she sought, and yet she had failed to stop it. The curse wasn't just about the past, it was about the future. It was about Mara. I fear that I cannot protect my family from the curse any longer. It is too late. I can only hope that the next generation will find a way to undo what I could not. But there is no time. The house is not a sanctuary. It is a tomb. And if the debt is not paid, if the promise is not kept, then we will all be bound to it. The letter ended there, the last words trailing off into a sense of finality that chilled Mara to her core. Her great-grandmother had failed, but she had left behind a message, a warning. And now it was her turn to face the consequences of that failure. As the days passed, Mara's sense of urgency grew. The whispers in the walls had become louder, the shadows in the corners darker. The woman in white was not content to wait any longer. She had come for Mara, and now it was time to make the ultimate choice. The storm had returned, more violent than ever, the house alive with the energy of a reckoning. Mara stood at the edge of the garden, staring out at the willow tree, the place where the promise had been made so long ago. The wind howled, the branches of the tree creaking and groaning as if they too were alive. She could feel the presence of the spirit behind her, just out of sight, waiting. Mara took a deep breath and walked toward the tree, the locket still clenched in her hand. As she approached, the air grew colder, the shadows lengthening. The woman in white appeared before her, her face pale and sorrowful, her eyes empty and pleading. Mara, the woman whispered, her voice like a soft breeze, the time has come. The house has chosen. Will you set me free? Mara's heart raced, the weight of the decision pressing down on her like an insurmountable mountain. She could feel the eyes of her ancestors upon her, the echoes of the past swirling around her, urging her to choose. The house, the curse, the promise. It was all tied to this moment. Mara raised the locket, the silver gleaming in the dim light. She knew now what had to be done. The debt could not be repaid with words, could only be paid with action. With a steady hand, she opened the locket, revealing the small compartment within. Inside, there was nothing but dust, nothing but the remnants of a promise made long ago. And then, with a quiet breath, Mara made the decision. She closed her eyes and whispered the words that would end it all. I will pay the price. The moment Mara whispered those words, the very air around her seemed to shudder in response, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The woman in white stood before her, her pale figure flickering with the light of the dying storm. Her eyes, deep, hollow, and sorrowful, met Mara's with a haunting intensity. The tension was unbearable, the weight of generations of guilt, silence, and broken promises hanging in the balance. "I will pay the price." The words echoed through the manor, through the ground beneath their feet, through the walls that had witnessed centuries of secrets. Mara could feel the ground tremble beneath her, a deep vibration that resonated from the very heart of Edgewater Manor, as though the house itself were awakening from a long slumber. The locket in her hand felt heavier, colder, as though it were alive with the memories of those who had come before her. The woman in white moved closer, her form flickering as if she were uncertain whether to approach or to retreat. The whispering voices in the walls grew louder, pressing in on Mara from all sides, their words incomprehensible yet filled with desperation. "You've made the choice," the woman in white said softly, her voice like a distant sigh. "Now the price must be paid." Mara could feel the pull, a deep, magnetic force drawing her toward the woman, toward the curse that had haunted her bloodline for generations. It was as though the very earth beneath her was reaching out, demanding an answer, a resolution to the centuries of suffering that had been woven into the fabric of this house. As the woman in white extended her hand, Mara hesitated for only a moment before placing her own in it. The instant their hands met, the world seemed to explode in a blaze of light. The ground beneath them cracked, and the air was filled with the sound of ancient chains rattling. It was as though the house itself was reacting to the moment. The long-held secret of the Sinclair family, the broken promise, was finally coming to its end. The woman's form seemed to dissolve into a cloud of mist, her face the last thing Mara saw before everything around her began to fade. In the distance, there was the faintest glimpse of a figure, a shadow that seemed both familiar and foreign. It was as if Mara were standing on the threshold between two worlds, between the past and the present, between life and death. And then the house went silent. The wind ceased, the rain stopped falling, and the storm outside seemed to still in its tracks. Mara stood alone beneath the willow tree, her hands still stretched out, but the woman in white was gone. The air around her felt still, peaceful, as if a great weight had been lifted. The house, for the first time in ages, seemed to breathe in relief. Mara looked down at the locket in her hand, its surface now warm, as if it had been touched by the light of the sun. It was no longer heavy with the burden of the past. The promise had been fulfilled, the debt paid, and the curse was broken. But Mara knew, deep down, that the cost had been more than she could ever fully understand. The woman in white, Eleanor Sinclair's lost soul, had been set free, but at what price? The spirit had sought release from the chains of the house, from the endless torment of a broken promise. And in doing so, Mara had paid the price of that freedom. The days that followed were filled with strange quiet. The manor was no longer haunted by the whispers, the flickering shadows, or the cold spots. The house was still, peaceful, even serene. The locket Mara held in her hand seemed to glow with an inner warmth, as though it had been returned to its rightful place. But in the deepest corners of her heart, Mara knew that she was forever changed. She returned to the library where it had all started, the ancient journals of her great-grandmother and Eleanor Sinclair spread across the table. She picked up the last page of Eleanor's diary, the one where the sentence had remained unfinished. She now understood what it meant. "If I do not make the sacrifice, she will..." Mara paused, placing the locket on the table beside the diary. The sacrifice was not just a physical one. It was a surrender of sorts, the acceptance of the weight of the past, the willingness to let go of the chains that had bound her family for generations. The curse was broken, but not without consequence. The freedom that came with it was bittersweet. She turned to leave, stepping out of the library and into the garden that stretched out before her. The willow tree, now free from the storm's grasp, stood tall and peaceful. The house behind her was no longer a prison. It had become a place of quiet reflection, a sanctuary where the past could finally rest. As Mara walked through the garden, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. A peace that came with the knowledge that she had done what no one else in her family had been able to do. She had broken the curse, fulfilled the promise, and set the spirits free. The wind whispered through the branches of the willow tree, and for the first time, Mara felt as though the house had exhaled a sigh of relief. The echoes of the past no longer haunted her. The weight of the locket in her hand was lighter now, and she realized with a quiet certainty that the past would never truly leave her. But it no longer controlled her. She had broken the cycle. The curse had been lifted, and as she gazed out at the horizon, a new chapter began. One where the whispers of the Midnight Manor would be nothing but a distant memory. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you have any thoughts, feedback, or ideas for future stories, please leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the soothing background music for a while. Wishing you a peaceful night. Take care, and sweet dreams.